So I want to thank, first of all of the organizers. Thank you so much. Thank you for permitting me to speak in English because my Arabic is so bad. But inshallah, maybe the next time I can do this in Arabic. And I am so sorry to have missed yesterday. We had a lot of troubles with, if you checked the news about Airbus, there were a lot of travel problems coming from America. Anyway, I am so happy to be here, so shukran. So, okay. What to, and this paper, it is about Ibn Rushd's interpretation of Plato's Republic. What to an Islamic political philosopher makes a good city? This paper attempts to partially answer this question through Ibn Rushd's interpretation of Plato in his only work, in Ibn Rushd's only work devoted exclusively to politics. The Mukhtasar Kitab al-Siyasa li Aflatun, usually I will call it the commentary on Plato's Republic. In the first treatise of the commentary, Ibn Rushd divides political science, al-ulum al-siyasiyya, into two parts. First, ethics, or as he says, the habits and volitional actions and conduct, as well as how those habits relate to each other and which ones are for the sake of others. So the first part is all ethics. This part, Ibn Rushd writes, is found in Aristotle's book known as the Nicomacheia, so the Nicomachean Ethics. The second part of political science is the subject of the commentary on Plato's Republic, and this part discusses how these habits, how the virtues, are established in souls, as well as other aspects of how habits are ordered with each other. And the focus here is on the realization and preservation of the virtues in community. But which are these virtues? What are the political virtues? Later, in the first treatise of the commentary, Ibn Rushd states that a good city is, he writes, wise, courageous, moderate, and just. These are the four noble virtues, of course. They are also borrowed directly from a discussion between Socrates and Glaucon in Book 4 of Plato's Republic. Ibn Rushd doesn't spend a lot of time on courage and moderation. He spends much more on wisdom and on justice. The part on wisdom is very interesting, I think, but for the sake of time, I will only focus on justice. For the present, concerning wisdom, to Ibn Rushd, it suffices to say that a good city's ruler rules in wisdom, which requires knowledge of the end, the telos, of man, and that knowledge can only be obtained through theoretical sciences or through philosophy, especially Burhan. As we will see, this discussion of wisdom actually sets us up for a kind of political hierarchy based on intellectual capacities. So I'm going to focus now on his discussion of justice, and specifically the role that this intellectual hierarchy plays in a just political order for Ibn Rushd. For unlike Plato in the Republic, Ibn Rushd is quite happy to define justice very straightforwardly, or at least so it seems. He writes, justice is nothing more than that every human in the city do the work that is his by nature in the best way that he possibly can. Of course, to do one's own work in the best way that he possibly can requires an understanding of what that work is. And this is part of his discussion of wisdom. It involves everyone understanding his own nature. In the first treatise, Ibn Rushd writes that just as justice in the soul of each person consists in every one of its parts doing only what it has to do in the appropriate measure and at the appropriate time, this necessarily occurring in the parts of the soul only when the intellect rules over them, so too in the case of the city. We famously know in Plato's Republic, justice in the soul is the small version of justice in the city. Right? They are justice writ large is political justice. So in the city, those who possess the theoretical sciences, these are the guardians of Plato's Republic and the philosophers, really. And then there is the one who rules over them. This is the philosopher king of Plato. They must be predominant within the city for Ibn Rushd. In order to have a just society, it is necessary that we have an intellectual hierarchy of those who possess theoretical sciences. These must rule, both as the philosopher king ultimately and then also as the guardians. This is true for Plato, and Ibn Rushd seems to express his approval of the idea. He He repeats this point again and again explicitly. That is, Ibn Rushd repeats this point again and again, and in his own voice. For instance, in a discussion concerning equity and justice, he writes, "We ourselves have already said that every single one of the people in this city, that is, in the good city, ought to lay hold on to only one of the activities of the city, namely that activity to which he is disposed by nature, that is, by his nature." Now, there is a great deal contained within these passages. First, it seems that Ibn Rushd is not only interpreting Plato's work, that would be one thing, but this is also his own commentary on the matter. Okay. So this is not just a recapitulation of Plato's writings. This is not only interpretation, it is between interpretation and philosophy, as it were. Indeed, Ibn Rushd's repetition of the notion that man is political by nature, this is the Aristotelian idea, this seems to refer principally to this idea that is, from the highest task of human perfection, which is obtaining virtue and theoretical or intellectual perfection, down to the level of mere existence, which is, the obtaining food and dwelling. It is clear that, Ibn Rushd writes, a man has need of other people. Hence, he is political by nature. But he shows this by discussing this hierarchy of needs. The highest and the best and the most perfect is the obtaining of virtue and intellectual virtues. The lowest is, of course, mere existence. This is certainly an Aristotelian point, and in that sense, it is to be expected from Ibn Rushd. But then what do these joint principles, the one that man has need of others and that the intellect must rule in both the individual soul and in the political society, what does this imply for political justice for Ibn Rushd? I should note that this is part of a chapter that is meant to be part of a book in which I am attempting to discern the political theory of Ibn Rushd, since he doesn't write directly on it very much. So what do these two principles, that man is a political animal, the Aristotelian principle, and the hierarchy of the intellect, not only in the soul but in the city, what does this imply for political justice? It seems undeniable that humans must at least play specialized roles in society in order to meet all of the needs. That is, a just society must have a specialization. In Ibn Rushd's description in the second treatise, this does create a hierarchy of humans, with those who are inclined to and capable of the theoretical sciences ruling those who are not. But logically, this need for what I would call cooperation does not automatically imply the need for such a strict hierarchy. So why does Ibn Rushd insist on both aspects? That is, not only that people have a specialized role, and not only that people be rational in their own souls, but why must there be such a strict hierarchy in the city? Well, it is tempting to just dismiss this, right? I think modern sensibilities tend to reject a strict hierarchy of, the ruling classes and everybody else, right? So we find this often distasteful, and it is easy to dismiss this as simply a commentary on Plato's Republic. But a number of factors work against this interpretation. First, again, Ibn Rushd writes, we ourselves have already said that this requires such a hierarchy, right? Suggesting that his own insistence on sticking to roles in political society, even if also Plato's idea. Secondly, it has to be acknowledged that the same hierarchy that he describes in the second treatise of Mukhtasar appears in other writings. The decisive treatise, Fasl al-Maqal, for instance, insists that those who are capable of Burhan are owed deference and authority. His long commentary on the metaphysics even refers to the Sharia khasa bil-hukma, so the Sharia that is for the philosophers. There seems to be a special preference not only for the intellect itself, but for those people who possess an especially strong intellect to have a special role as it concerns politics and even, as it seems in the metaphysics, even in law, right? So for Ibn Rushd to be considered a straightforwardly hierarchical political thinker is not really an unreasonable position. In fact, it's difficult to avoid this. I maintain, though, that it is not fully necessary to reason this way. To explain why not, we have to note that Ibn Rushd apparently assigns these cognitive classes to human beings. He classifies them cognitively with those who possess the theoretical sciences at top in terms of both intellect and the ability to reach the end. He writes, the end, that is the telos, that is truly the end of human existence as well as political rule. I discuss elsewhere in the book, but also it's not a surprise to anyone that the end that is truly the end for Ibn Rushd, that is the end that is truly man's end, is happiness. So those who are able most to reach that end are those who are most capable of theoretical sciences, really, because in order to reach happiness, you must have a strong grasp on the theoretical sciences. Okay, and indeed, implicit is in this text is the Aristotelian principle that nature plays a substantial role in ordering the city. Nature makes nothing in vain, as Aristotle would say, and therefore those who are created with an extra intellectual ability, well, that extra intellectual ability must serve some end, in this case, to Ibn Rushd, it's ruling. Having said that, ruling itself has been dismissed in the Mukhtasar as an end in itself. It is really a means to serve this ultimate end that is truly man's end. Right? He dismisses it explicitly as the end of a good life, effectively. So it is also the case as we look at this role that nature plays. He writes, each person, right, must have a natural disposition corresponding to the difference in their perfections. Now, that point might seem to contribute little here. We've already established that people have different natures. But on reflection, the fact that the ordering of the city, and not just of the individual soul, begins with nature's endowment of humans, and that what follows from that is a hierarchy, it does suggest that this hierarchy is not, for instance, sanctioned by divine law. This matters because our interpretation of nature, our understanding of nature is perhaps more fluid, more flexible, more subject to change in different eras than interpretation of divine law, for instance, or prophecy. Beyond that, even laying aside the sort of flexibility that I'm proposing of nature, it seems even to Ibn Rushd, nature can only get us so far. In speaking of human perfections, which are, again, the most perfect is the intellectual, the capacity for theoretical demonstration, Ibn Rushd writes that little of these actually exist by nature. Rather, people are born with dispositions pointing to these perfections, but there is no sure sufficiency in nature that these completions will reach us in their perfection. Rather, they reach us only through will and skillfulness. In fact, he writes, the efficient cause in bringing about human perfections are choice and will. So it seems that the ability to reach the end that is man's highest end, that ultimate happiness, which is attained through theoretical perfection, while it is certainly connected with nature, it is not in any way determined by nature, nor does it seem that it is inherently as fixed as it might appear in the beginning. Now, none of this, of course, eliminates Ibn Rushd's obviously hierarchical view of political life and of a justly ordered society. But the point I mean to highlight is that Ibn Rushd, and indeed like Plato in this sense, leaves a great deal of room for the role of human effort, for choice and will, for the cultivation of virtue. And we have to recall that in the beginning, for Ibn Rushd, as for Aristotle, the first part of political science is ethics. These are habituations. These are cultivated in one's own soul, and one has a great deal of agency in cultivating those. Now, for Aristotle, it's true that the cultivation of these virtues required a good upbringing. There was not much that one could do if one did not have the proper upbringing in a good city. And Ibn Rushd agrees with this to a great extent. At the same time, Ibn Rushd had, I think, the benefit of living in a time in which there are what he calls the two, which he calls in the Fasl al-Maqal, the milk sisters. Not only hikmah, but sharia. There are two paths to obtaining these virtues, to seeking excellence. So in this sense, the hierarchy that seems so fixed in the first reading of political justice for Ibn Rushd is in fact one that is open to all by one path or the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your excellent topic about